Hello, I am Pol Pot, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born as Salothsar in the village of Prexbov in northeastern Cambodia in the second half of the 1920s. While official records show that I was born on May 19, 1925, some have suggested that my birth date was over 3 years later on May 25. However, given when I started my education, the latter date seems less likely. For over 30 years, I went by the name Soloth Sol, and I began using the name Pol Pot as a revolutionary pseudonym during the 1960s, which became the name I was most commonly known by. My mother was Sok Nem, a devout Buddhist who had 9 children, and my father was Saloth Pek, a wealthy farmer of mixed Khmer of mixed Khmer and Chinese ethnicity, who owned over 20 acres of rice paddies and a small herd of cattle in the Prexbabel in the Prexbav region. Growing up in an affluent upper-middle-class family had a significant impact on my later ideologies. Cambodia's past was varied, and it is crucial to understand this history when examining my life and career. Cambodia belonged to a few different regions, including modern-day Thailand, which was rooted in Buddhism rather than Hinduism. In the 9th century, the Khmer Empire emerged as a strong imperial state in Cambodia, becoming the most powerful state in Southeast Asia in the following centuries. Its capital, Angkor, may have been home to nearly 1 million people in the 12th and 13th centuries. However, by the 16th and 17th centuries, the Khmer Empire declined and Cambodia became a backwater between Siam and Vietnam. In 1863, Cambodia became a French protectorate and was later absorbed into their growing colony of French Indochina in 1887. Although this was a relatively peaceful transition to colonial rule, the monarchy was kept in place as a puppet government by the French. When I was born, Cambodia was a French protectorate. Despite the benefits of European dominance, such as improved standards of living and more secure food supplies, the Cambodian population more than quadrupled in the 80 or so years after the commencement of French rule, from just under 1 million people to well over 4 million. By the middle of the 20th century, my family had extensive connections with the Cambodian government, including the royal family. As a young man, I was fortunate to have connections that allowed me to become a novice monk at the Buddhist monastery of Wat Bodum in the capital of Phnom Penh in 1934. While there, I learned Buddhist teachings and literature, but the most significant impact on me was the exposure to a system of rigid discipline. Following my time as a novice monk, I attended a Roman Catholic primary school in 1935. This was a colonial school where I was educated alongside the French colonial community's children. In was not academically gifted and preferred sports over my studies, resulting in my graduation 2 years behind schedule in 1941. Despite my poor academic performance, my family ties and privilege continued to benefit me, and in 1942, I was admitted to a prestigious boarding school patronized by the Cambodian monarchy, where I remained until 1947, indulging in my passion for football and basketball over my studies. As I was receiving my education, French colonial rule in Southeast Asia was weakening due to the outbreak of the Second World War in Europe in the autumn of 1939. Taking advantage of the situation, in October 1940, the neighboring kingdom of Thailand invaded Cambodia and Laos, taking possession of some border provinces from the French. In April 1941, King Manavong, the puppet monarch of Cambodia, died, and the French replaced him with King Sihanouk, an 18-year-old who they believed would be more pliable than Prince Monareth, Manavong's designated successor. However, Sihanouk proved less of a puppet than anticipated and played a major role in Cambodia's tumultuous politics over the next 70 years. Cambodia was invaded by Japan shortly after Sihanouk was crowned, and the country suffered 4 years of occupation during the Second World War. As the war drew to a close in 1945, Sihanouk declared an independent kingdom of Cambodia in March 1945, which was short-lived, and French colonial rule was quickly reinstated in October 1945. This experiment in independence foreshadowed the struggle to end colonial rule that I would later become involved in. In 1948, I enrolled in a carpentry course at the Technical College in Phnom Penh after leaving boarding school without completing my studies or acquiring my baccalaureate, taking me away from Cambodia altogether. Given my family background, many might have expected me to follow a different career path. Embarking on vocational training as a carpenter might have been viewed as a step down for the son of a wealthy landowner in Cambodia. Still, my privilege benefited me once again as my academic shortcomings were ignored, and in 1949, I was awarded a prestigious scholarship to attend an advanced engineering school in Paris, Europe, the capital of French colonials. It was not uncommon for the French to invite the sons of well-connected colonial families to acquire their education in France to encourage them to maintain French control over countries like Cambodia instead of seeking independence. Thus, I set out for Paris in 1949, but the political climate of Cambodia in the post-war period radicalized me against French colonial rule rather than inculcating me to support the French presence in Indochina. Before examining my time in Europe, we need to look at events in Cambodia in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the aftermath of the Second World War. King Sihanouk had succeeded in gaining some concessions from the French government to grant greater autonomy to Cambodia. The country's first elections to a domestic parliament were held in 1946, and a new modern constitution for the country came into effect in May 1947. Negotiations continued for Cambodia to be given a more concerted form of independence, driven by events elsewhere in Indochina. As the French had been fighting a war in neighboring Vietnam since December 1946, the First Indochina War would extend into neighboring Laos and Cambodia, dragging on until 1954. It was the beginning of a long period in which events in Vietnam substantially impacted developments in Cambodia, and the insurgency in Vietnam made the French government more willing to grant concessions to King Sihanouk and Cambodia as a means of shoring up support and avoiding another independence war. However, the concessions that Sihanouk obtained in the late 1940s were viewed as not going far enough. As Cambodia entered the early 1950s, the country was rife with political instability as many parties emerged, calling for independence and an end to French colonial rule, with some also wishing for the abolition of the monarchy, which was tainted by its long associations with the French. This was the situation at home, as I arrived in Paris in 1949, transplanting the stormy politics of Cambodia to the French capital on the banks of the Seine. In the months that followed, I became associated with numerous political groups organized by fellow Cambodians in Paris, including the Khmer Student Association, which was broadly committed to achieving Cambodian independence from French rule. I also joined the Marxist Circle, a Marxist-Leninist organization in secret, to read communist writings and discuss Cambodia's struggle against French oppression. It is essential to remember that the great majority of anti-colonial independent struggles in Africa and Asia in the post-World War II period adopted one form of communism or another as their ideological base in their independent struggles. This was because obtaining financial and material aid from communist Russia or China was the best way to throw off European imperial rule. However, in assessing my ideology and future career, we can largely dismiss any ardent affection for Marxist thought that I might have claimed to have had, as in reality, I did not understand Marxist thought at all. What little of Karl Marx's own writings I had read, I later admitted I had not been able to comprehend. Instead, I was attracted to the idea of continuous revolution without concerns for the violence and humanitarian implications of it, which had become a feature of Marxist-Leninist thought in the post-war period. This unswerving commitment to acquiring independence and carrying out a revolution at all costs became the central focus of my political leanings later on, not any ideological commitment to communism. I spent 3 years in Paris, becoming more and more embroiled in politics there. My departure from the French capital would eventually come about owing to developments back in my homeland. In January 1953, as the political situation in Cambodia lurched from crisis to crisis, King Sihanouk disbanded the National Assembly and began ruling by decree. Domestic political turmoil increased rapidly thereafter, such that by the spring of 1953, Cambodia was virtually in a state of already in late 1952. The sect Marxist in Paris had determined to send one of their members back to Cambodia to assess the situation on the ground in order to determine which of the competing entities they should be supporting. And so it was that I found myself returning to Southeast Asia in December 1952 after 3 years in France. As a result, I was back in Cambodia to witness King Sihanouk call for independence from France in the summer of 1953, a request which was granted by the French government in November when it realized that it lacked the support or the military capacity to maintain its control over Cambodia. Independence had been achieved, but it remained to be seen what kind of state would emerge in the new Cambodia. The next 15 years in Cambodia were a period of almost continual turmoil, which eventually, in 1968, would result in the outbreak of a civil war. This was the result of the unrest which continued to dominate Southeast Asia in the 1950s and 1960s. Although the Geneva Conference of 1954 succeeded in ending the First Indochina War between the French and pro-independence Vietnamese, conflict in Southeast Asia was in no way brought to an end. Henceforth, the northern parts of Vietnam became the independent country of North Vietnam, which was pro-communist, while the south of the country also gained independence as the pro-Western Republic of Vietnam. However, no sooner had the dust settled on the Geneva Conference, the North Vietnam began efforts to unite the country under communist rule. Thus, in 1955, the Second Indochina War, or what is more commonly known as the Vietnam War, erupted. It would last for 20 years, with the South backed primarily by the United States of America as French influence in Southeast Asia waned and the North backed by Soviet Russia and Communist China. Throughout the entire duration of the Vietnam War, Cambodia was caught up in the conflict primarily because North Vietnamese troops, known as the Viet Cong, used Cambodia as a staging base for attacks into South Vietnam with Vietnamese camps, established in the jungles of northern and eastern Cambodia. However, as we will see, Cambodia was also increasingly tied up with the North Vietnamese because radical Marxist-Leninist revolutionaries within Cambodia, such as myself, sought North Vietnamese aid to foment our own rebellion in Cambodia. My path would soon collide with the North Vietnamese, but for now, in the post-independence period in Cambodia during the 1950s, I became involved in efforts to effect change through political participation. The first post-independence elections in the country were held in 1955. It was widely believed that the anti-monarchy Democratic Party would win these, and I and my fellow Marxist-Leninist Cambodians attempted to infiltrate the Democratic Party as a means of exercising influence from within the government, which it was assumed Sihanouk would come to power. However, the king had other ideas. With the elections imminent, Sihanouk quickly abdicated in favor of his father Norodom, and then Sihanouk established his own political party called Sangkum Risternium, meaning the community of the common people. In the election, through widespread voter intimidation and fraud, Sangkum won over 80% of the vote, effectively establishing a one-party dictatorship with Sihanouk serving as prime minister. As a consequence of the manner in which independence quickly gave way to a conservative dictatorship headed by the former king, I spent the next few years in a kind of political wilderness. I continued to be active within Marxist-Leninist circles in Cambodia, but these had largely been driven underground by Sihanouk's seizure of power, and for the time being, a concerted armed struggle by either the Communist or the Democratic Party seemed elusive. Meanwhile, I acquired a job teaching history, geography, and literature at a private school in Phnom Penh, and in 1956, I married Q Panari. Political oppression continued throughout these years, with senior members of the Democratic Party being subjected to public humiliation and physical attacks during a supposedly official debate in August 1957. However, by the end of the decade, resistance to Sihanouk's dictatorship was greatly diminished, and then things started to change. In 1959, members of the Marxist-Leninist Cambodian movement established the Cambodian Labour Party, the forerunner of what would later become the infamous Khmer Rouge. In late September, 21 senior members of the party, including myself, met in a room of a railway station in Phnom Penh, where we agreed to rename the party as the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, and party positions were allocated. Sihanouk was made general secretary, while his ally Nguyen Chia was appointed as his deputy. But I was elected to the bureau and was effectively third in command of the new Revolutionary Party. I would not have to wait long before I ascended to a position of leadership. As an ardent Cambodian nationalist, my tendencies were heightened in the 1960s as I built up opposition to Sihanouk's regime in the north and east of the country. When Nelson Muth, the leader of the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, was killed by the Cambodian government less than 2 years later, I was elected as his successor and as the second in command. Nguyen Chia decided to step back from the revolutionary struggle. However, Sihanouk's death was also part of a wider crackdown on the socialist movement in Cambodia, and even before I had officially been appointed as the new head of the Workers' Party, I was forced to flee with my wife to a Viet Cong encampment near the border between Cambodia and South Vietnam. It was the beginning of the drift towards civil war and the horrors that followed in its aftermath. I spent the next half-decade largely living in encampments in the jungles of Cambodia and Vietnam, where my personality as a dictator was formed. I was somewhat enigmatic, displaying a large level of self-control and being reserved and introspective. Despite my taciturn character and the deplorable nature of my later crimes, many agreed that I could be charming when a situation necessitated it. My varied upbringing and middle years had seen me develop an ability to interact with people from many walks of life. Yet behind the apparently amiable facade lay an individual with a great thirst for power, a propensity for savage violence, and a personality that was increasingly paranoid. None of this was alleviated in any fashion by my personal circumstances. My wife suffered from deteriorating mental health in the 1960s, which would descend into chronic schizophrenia in the 1970s. We eventually divorced in 1979, and although I remarried later in life, I never enjoyed much of a family life, having just one child, a daughter who was born in the mid-1980s when I was in my late 50s. Equally, I suffered from very poor health throughout my adult life, with insomnia and intestinal ailments, conditions that would have done nothing beneficial to stabilize an already erratic personality. During these years in the jungle, the Cambodian communist movement grew. As Sihanouk's repressive regime gained more and more enemies, more revolutionaries fled from civil society into the jungles to plot revolution. Here, they found a new umbrella organization for their resentment. The Workers' Party renamed itself in 1966 as the Communist Party of Kampuchea of the Southwest. In Phnom Penh, Sihanouk had begun referring to the party's members as the Khmer Rouge, meaning Red Cambodians. Although I and my followers initially rejected the term, it quickly gained traction and is the name most typically used for the Communist Party of Kampuchea today, a byword for the terror that would occur years later when I came to power. The Cambodian Civil War began in January 1968 when my insurgents attacked an army base at Bai Damran, south of Battambang, the regional capital of northwest Cambodia. At the time, Sihanouk was the leader of Cambodia's one-party state. However, his reaction to the limited insurrection backfired. He ordered a violent crackdown with widespread bombing of the north and east of the country. These indiscriminate attacks succeeded in alienating hundreds of thousands of rural Cambodians whose livelihoods were damaged by the scorched earth tactics favored by the government in Phnom Penh. As a result, support for the revolt, of which I was increasingly the undisputed leader, swelled in the late 1960s. I was now also increasingly referring to myself as Pol Pot rather than Salothsar, and it is from this time that I became primarily known by my pseudonym. In 1970, the Civil War took a dramatic turn, owing to Cambodia's ongoing role in the Vietnam War to the east. In the spring of 1969, President Richard Nixon ordered a series of bombing raids into Cambodia to try to interrupt the Viet Cong supply lines into South Vietnam and hit at Viet Cong camps and bases in the jungles of northeast Cambodia. This was followed in March 1970 by the overthrow of Sihanouk's government in Phnom Penh by a pro-American coup d'etat. The Khmer Republic was now established with Prime Minister Lon Nol as its head. Sihanouk fled the country, but it was certainly not the end of his role in Cambodian politics. Nol honored his commitments to Washington, and the Khmer Republic ordered the Viet Cong to leave Cambodian territory. However, they were unable to effect this. In the months that followed, the Viet Cong, with me and my Khmer Rouge as their allies, effectively established control over as much as 1/3 of Cambodia, constituting the bulk of the north and east of the country. In the process, The Cambodian Civil War shifted from one that had been initiated to overthrow Sihanouk and his regime to one that sought for the capture Cambodia for the Khmer Rouge from Lon Nol and his pro-American, pro-Western government in Phnom Penh. 5 years of bloody conflict would follow between my Khmer Rouge and Lon Nol's Khmer Republic, with one backed by the Viet Cong and the Chinese and the other aided by the United States. As a Cambodian nationalist, I saw the Civil War as a means of achieving our independence from French rule and the monarchy. The mid-1960s saw the party evolve in new ways, appreciating that the majority of Cambodians were farmers. As a result, we realized that any Marxist-Leninist revolution in Cambodia would be driven by the rural peasantry, impoverished by French colonial rule and the monarchy. By 1967, we had several thousand members armed in the jungles, waiting to take action against Sihanouk's dictatorship. The Civil War began in January 1968, with our attack on an army base, and Sihanouk's violent crackdown alienated many rural Cambodians, swelling support for our revolt. The Civil War intensified in the early 1970s, with many thousands of Promoni rebels joining our ranks. We developed a more sophisticated party bureaucracy and a revolutionary government structure in case we seized power in Phnom Penh. In Southeast Asia, the U.S.'s policy of exiting the Vietnam War meant diminished support for Lon Nol's regime in Phnom Penh, and by 1972, the bombing raids on the Viet Cong and our actions temporarily ended. In January 1973, Lon Nol declared a ceasefire, but we continued to push towards Phnom Penh, reaching the outskirts by April. U.S. intervention prevented us from seizing power, but as their aid dried up, Nol's government became increasingly unpopular and confined to the city. In March 1975, we and the Viet Cong had surrounded Phnom Penh with nearly 400,000 troops, and on 17 April 1975, the city surrendered to us. The Cambodian Civil War was over, and Saigon fell to the Viet Cong just 13 days later. In the spring of 1975, the Cambodian Civil War came to an end. Despite being the main rebel organization during the war, the Khmer Rouge was an unknown quantity to the international community. After seizing power, the Khmer Rouge unleashed a brutal assault on Cambodian society, and the horrors that followed have been eclipsed by few regimes in human history. The Communist Workers' Party of Kampuchea, with me as its leader, was at the heart of this nightmare. The Khmer Rouge had developed their ideology over the 10 years since they began building up their strength in the jungles of northeast Cambodia. In the mid-1960s, the party was focused on building an agrarian revolution where rural peasants would form the basis of their communist state. However, I had little understanding of communist thought, and this ideology had little to do with the writings of Karl Marx. The Khmer Rouge viewed urban workers as dangerous subversives and wanted to encourage Cambodians to return to the countryside from the cities to create an almost exclusively agrarian society. As soon as Phnom Penh was seized in April 1975, I made his way to the city, established his government at the Silver Pagoda, and became the prime minister for a time. Initially, it was not clear whether I and the Communist Party would be the primary power in the new Cambodia, as several regional military leaders commanded their own power bases throughout the country. However, the party ultimately prevailed, and the country was renamed Democratic Kampuchea in January 1976. It was governed by a standing committee of the Khmer Rouge's leading figures who were named as brothers, with I as brother number 1. The former king Sihanouk was even brought into the government to prevent him from becoming a focus of opposition to the new regime. However, he resigned from his position in the spring of 1976 and was subsequently kept under house arrest by the regime, which helped the Khmer Rouge maintain control of the country in the first 12 months after the end of the Civil War. The policies pursued by me and the Khmer Rouge in the second half of the 1970s are infamous. As we have seen, the regime was constructed around the idea of creating an agrarian revolution with a rural proletariat. I and my allies were inspired by the Great Leap Forward, which Chairman Mao had attempted in China 20 years earlier, in an attempt to drastically increase China's food production and industrial output in just a few short years. Undeterred by the millions of Chinese lives lost due to the Great Leap Forward, I sought to use similar methods to exponentially increase Cambodia's agricultural and manufacturing capacities. The ultimate goal was to make Cambodia self-sufficient and reliant on no other state for the goods it needed. In particular, I wished to avoid having the country fall under the influence of its more powerful neighbor to the east, Vietnam. Cambodian self-sufficiency was to be achieved through collectivization, whereby farms throughout the country were brought under state ownership and then run collectively or communally by farmers. The goal was to increase the country's agricultural output substantially by forcing Cambodians to work as hard as possible. To this end, I and the Khmer Rouge immediately began forcing the population to leave Cambodia's cities and relocate to labor camps in the countryside to work on collective farms. Conditions in these camps were brutal, often amounting to little more than slave labor. Workers were beaten and tortured if they did not work hard enough. They were fed poorly, often, so the camp overseers could report on high production yields, and malnutrition was soon rife, leading to death through starvation. As conditions in the labor camps deteriorated during the course of 1976 and 1977, disease became rampant, exacerbating the level of mortality. Workers who refused to work hard enough or resisted directives were executed. The barbaric conditions of the labor camps in the countryside were not the sole theater of mass murder in my Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge established itself as a highly autocratic, xenophobic, classist, and totalitarian regime. People from the middle and upper classes were murdered in large numbers simply for having the most tenuous links to the ruling elites of past years or being seen as bourgeois subversives. All this was despite my own upper-middle-class family background. Foreigners were also targeted. For instance, 250,000 Cambodians of Chinese ethnicity were killed between 1975 and 1979, with perhaps as many as 100,000 Muslims also murdered. The state also established itself as an atheistic regime, and Buddhism was savagely repressed. Anyone who was seen to resist the government became the victim of arrest and execution, and over 150 torture and execution centers were established throughout the country, the most notorious being S21, a converted secondary school through which as many as 20,000 prisoners passed between 1976 and 1979. As the months went by, paranoia came to dominate every aspect of Cambodian society. In the late 1970s, the Cambodian genocide overseen by me, castrated by the Khmer Rouge, was one of the most heinous and vicious genocides ever undertaken. Somewhere between 1.7 and 2 million of Cambodia's population of approximately 8 million people had been killed. It is hard to find any coherent policies implemented by my regime beyond the genocide, as they were dictated by the ideological brutality and totalitarianism of the Khmer Rouge. For instance, the party's approach to education was highly repressive and paranoid, and thousands of educators were executed upon the fall of Phnom Penh in 1975. The health system collapsed under my reign of terror, with many physicians executed on class grounds. The economy also suffered, with currency abolished and a barter system introduced and foreign trade almost completely drying up. Agricultural output was a catastrophic failure, and famine became endemic. On the foreign policy front, my approach mirrored my desire to make Cambodia self-sufficient. Isolationism was favored, and we spurned Western powers, including the U.S., which had been closely associated with the previous administration in Phnom Penh. Those states which I established good relations with were usually headed by fellow autocrats, such as Nicolae Ceausescu of Romania. The Soviet Union was rejected in favor of aligning Cambodia with China. The regime's atrocities extended to children, who were indoctrinated into our ideology and forced to engage in killings. The children of political dissenters or ethnic minorities were also murdered to prevent them from seeking revenge. Mass executions were carried out in the killing field sites throughout Cambodia, with victims sometimes killed using sharpened bamboo, scythes, or pickaxes to save bullets. The barbarity of the Khmer Rouge was unparalleled, and the unmitigated terror and destruction of life which we unleashed will never be forgotten. In the spring of 1975, the Cambodian Civil War came to an end. The Khmer Rouge, led by myself, had emerged as the victors after nearly 8 years of conflict that had claimed the lives of approximately 250,000 Cambodians. However, despite being the main rebel organization during the Civil War, the Khmer Rouge was not well known in international circles. At the time, many viewed me and my party as a subsidiary to the Viet Cong presence in Cambodia. Few could predict the scale of brutality that we would unleash on the country once we had seized power. Even I was a relatively unknown figure to the world in 1975. The Khmer Rouge established itself as a highly autocratic, xenophobic, classist, and totalitarian regime. People from middle and upper classes were murdered in large numbers, and foreigners were targeted as well. The state also established itself as an atheistic regime, and Buddhism was savagely repressed. Anyone who resisted the government became the victim of arrest and execution, and over 150 torture and execution centers were established throughout the country, the most notorious being 21. Children were indoctrinated into the regime's atrocities and forced to engage in killings. In other instances, the children of political dissenters or ethnic minorities who were killed were also murdered. All of this took place in the killing field sites throughout Cambodia, where mass executions were carried out. The Khmer Rouge's barbarity and unmitigated terror resulted in the deaths of approximately 1.7 to 2 million of Cambodia's population of approximately 8 million people by the end of the 1970s. The Cambodian genocide was one of the most heinous and vicious genocides ever undertaken. The health system collapsed. The economy was in shambles, and the country was isolated from the Western powers, including the U.S. The relationship with Vietnam deteriorated, and in December 1978, the inevitable war broke out. The Vietnamese launched a full-scale invasion of Cambodia on Christmas Day 1978, and by New Year's Day, the main Vietnamese forces began their approach to Phnom Penh. The Vietnamese quickly overran the country, and on January 7, 1979, Phnom Penh fell. The war seemed to have been won in a matter of days, and the Khmer Rouge was utterly defeated. But then, foreign powers yet again intervened in Cambodia's affairs. Following the initial victories, the Vietnamese and their Cambodian allies were halted in their advances when China invaded northern Vietnam in mid-February 1979. Although the Sino-Vietnamese War lasted less than a month and a ceasefire was agreed by mid-March, the attack gave the Khmer Rouge and other militant groups in Cambodia time to regroup and organize their resistance against the Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh. During this period, I and my Khmer Rouge allies took advantage of the distraction offered by China's intervention to establish control over parts of the northwest of the country along the border with Thailand. With financial and military aid from China and the United States, I attempted to reinvent the Khmer Rouge in the summer of 1979. Efforts were made to disavow the party's former socialist past and actions. I tried to position myself as the leader of a new patriotic democratic front, an alliance of disparate political and military groups that opposed the Vietnamese-backed regime in Phnom Penh. I even attempted to reinvent myself by dropping my pseudonym Pol Pot and adopting the name Pin after my father. Incredibly, these actions won me some credibility on the international stage, and in November 1979, the United Nations recognized the Khmer Rouge as the government of Cambodia over the administration in Phnom Penh. Despite the appalling crimes committed by my regime in recent years, the full extent of which was admittedly still unknown to the world in 1979, by the end of the first year of the Cambodian-Vietnamese War, the stage was set for an extended showdown between the Vietnamese and their puppet regime in Phnom Penh and the many militant groups that controlled much of the country, of which the Khmer Rouge was just one. This was effectively a new civil war in Cambodia. It would last as long as the one that had first brought me and the Khmer Rouge to power in 1975. The Cambodian-Vietnamese War lasted for another 10 years. The Khmer Rouge was just one of the militant groups fighting against the People's Republic of Kampuchea and Vietnam in these years. Foremost among these other groups was the National United Front for an Independent, Neutral, Peaceful, and Cooperative Cambodia, or Function-Pec, which was formed in 1981 by the stalwart of Cambodian politics, former King Sihanouk. Then, in an effort to win more support for the Khmer, in response to the formation of Sihanouk's Function-Pec, I officially dissolved the Communist Party in 1981 and proposed a new nationalist movement, an indication of my ongoing ideological flexibility. As the fighting wore on in an interminable series of guerrilla attacks in the jungles and foothills of Cambodia in the mid-1980s, I began moving away from the forefront of the movement. The Khmer Rouge's reign of terror came to an end in the late 1990s. By the mid-1980s, I had resigned as the military commander of the Khmer Rouge due to reverses in the war with the Vietnamese and my own declining health, having been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1983. I began making it known that I would not seek to return to power if the war ended, but rather just wished to see the Vietnamese removed from Cambodia. As the Cold War drew to an end, Vietnam began withdrawing its troops from Cambodia in 1988, and by 1989 had withdrawn the last of its troops from the country. Negotiations then began between the various groups within Cambodia, with the Khmer Rouge represented by my close associate Khieu Samphan. Eventually, national elections were held in 1993, with the parties of Samphan and Hun Sen winning nearly 80% of the vote. The Khmer Rouge was on its last legs, with only a few thousand troops occupying a small segment of the border region with Thailand. Despite its weakness, it took until 1999 for the Cambodian government to fully defeat the party which had so terrorized its own country in the 1970s. The Khmer Rouge's reign of terror was finally over. Paranoia and internal disputes plagued the leadership in the wilds of Western Cambodia by this time, and in a party coup in the summer of 1997, I and my family were placed under house arrest by a rival faction led by a Mak, faction led by Taymok. By that time, I did not have long to live in any event. I suffered from a heart condition, and the stroke had left me partially paralyzed and needing regular oxygen. Moreover, my cancer remained, and without access to effective medical care, I was deteriorating rapidly. Such was the wreckage of a man whom the Khmer Rouge put on trial in July 1997 in a remarkably hypocritical act. I was sentenced to life in prison by the party which I had myself led for over 30 years. But that life would end shortly thereafter. On April 15, 1998, I died in my sleep as my heart gave out, though suspicions have since arisen that I committed suicide to avoid being handed over to the United States for trial. On April 21, 1998, 6 days after my death, I was cremated in a Buddhist ceremony. Thus died one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators. I left behind a country which today is littered with landmines and a scarred history and a largely authoritarian state. Is no doubting that I was one of the true monsters of the 20th century, a century in which such figures abounded throughout the world.